Okay, so I'm going to look at presidential election, mostly the second round of presidential election. So, in France, the presidential election started in 1965. Well, there was one in 1848, but the winner decided to become an emperor and to stop elections altogether. So people sort of, it took a century to sort of recover from this bad experience. And the modern experience with presidential elections started in 1965. Under the Third Republic, the president had very little power and was elected by parliament. So it's usually quite tied. I don't look at the second round with the extreme right, but I will tell you more later about the extreme right. I also look at legislative election. So, in France, there's an incredible diversity of political parties. The country has a lot of imagination to create new parties. And this, again, happened 2 years ago. But this is not new. There's just a national tradition of, so you have SFIO, Parti Socialiste, Radical on the left, MRP, CNIP, UNR on the right. So it changes all the time. But, people are able to recognize them. Whatever they change their names, they sort of know who they are, they know what they say, more or less. So here I have done this very simple categorization where I put all the parties which voters themselves locate at they are typically asked to locate parties on a left to right axis, 1 to 10. So I just put all parties that are located on the left, which are viewed on the left traditionally, but of course they have changed a lot over time in their platform, and this is the key message of the paper, is that they are not really the left party of the 50s or 60s, but I want to follow their evolution. I put also all the right party, including extreme right, together with the right. This is because I want to compare with the two-party system, Democrat, Republican in the US and Labour, Conservative in Britain. So, here I don't do justice to all the, subtlety of the French party system between extreme right, center right, and middle right, or whatever, and same for the left. But, you also have these subtleties within the Republican Party or within the Conservative Party. It's just that it does not materialize into different parties, so it's a different institutional organization, but it doesn't mean that everybody agrees, of course. So for the sake of comparison, that's what I'm going to do. And so the key finding is a reversal of the education cleavage. So as we will see, this is really a complete reversal in the sense that at the beginning of the period, the more educated you are, the more you vote to the right. At the end of the period, it's exactly the opposite. And so it's really monotonically increasing to monotonically decreasing. This is highly significant. So I will show you simple residual of, regression where I put new controls one by one, and you will see that, this does not affect the result in any way. Okay, so let me start. So this is the simpler case where, I've already shown you that, the university graduate used to vote more for the right. At the end, they vote more for the left. Now, this is much more general than this. So here I start by showing you 4 years, 1956, 73, 1995, 2012. So you can see in 1956, you have 72% of the electorate who has no secondary or higher education degree. The most they have is primary education. And they vote massively for the left parties, socialist, communist, radical party of the time, whereas people with higher education, it's only 5% of the population, and they really don't like the left too much. Then it starts changing over time. At the end of the period, well, here I show you 2012, I will show you 2017 later. You can see this is exactly the opposite. Okay, the higher you go, the more you vote for the left. So the people with higher education, they like Hollande a lot more than Sarkozy. Okay, so they have changed, the whole thing has changed completely. Now, what's interesting is that, of course, this is a period of huge educational expansion. So this, here you have 72% with no education. So most of their children and grandchildren, they have moved up the education ladder. Everybody has a grandparent or grand-grandparent that was uneducated, so everybody comes from the bottom in terms of education, in a way. So some of their children and grandchildren have moved to higher education. Typically, they like Hollande a lot as compared to Sarkozy. Those who have gone to secondary education, who have their baccalaureate, well, they like Hollande a little bit more than Sarkozy, but, they are very tight. And those who stayed at the level of primary education, who did not complete their high school degree, they really prefer Sarkozy. So in the end, in effect, what used to be the left parties, which were attracting more vote at the bottom of the education institution, has become the party of in effect, the winners of the education, from a descriptive viewpoint. So this is really what happened. Now, this happens, if you take the election at the beginning of the period, you could say it's just random, but it's like this. At the beginning of the period, it's like this. At every election, it's always monotonically declining. At the end of the period, it's always monotonically increasing. So it's not, and if you look at all the election over the period, you can see at the beginning it's declining. Then in the middle of the period, it sort of starts to flatten, and there's no real, curve. And at the end of the period, it becomes steeply increasing. Okay, so it's really a long-run process, and we are going to find exactly the same for US, UK, which is sort of this long-run transformation of a curve that used to be, downward sloping that becomes upward sloping. This is also true within higher education. So starting in 1973, I can distinguish between if you have a short higher education degree or a long higher education degree. So short is 2-year degree or 3-year degree. Long is more master degree, grande école degree. So in 1973, if you come out of a grande école, you really vote for Giscard much more than Mitterrand. I mean, you always have left-wing people among the young, but it's not so common. I mean, the idea that the educated people vote for the left, it was not like this at all at that time, and even less so in the 50s or 60s, and we'll see the same in the US. In the 50s, 60s, high education, they vote Republican much more than Democrat. So and then this has changed. And at the end of the period, people, the higher you go, the more you vote to the left. So if you come from the grande école, you vote more for the left than if you have a short 2-year, 3-year degree. So it really has become a party of the winner of the education game, in effect. So this is a simple summary, university graduate minus non-university graduate. But in fact, it would also be true. If I was to take secondary graduates and more versus primary and less, if I was to take the top 50% versus the bottom 50, no matter how you slice the data, given that you go from monotonically decreasing to monotonically increasing, you will get a change. So these are the confidence intervals. So they are quite large, especially at the beginning of the period, because the sample size is not very large, but it's clearly, in the long run, this is the evolution is okay. Now, you could say, well, okay, but, the university graduates, they vote for Hollande against Sarkozy just because they are young and excited and they like the left, but, it has nothing to do with their degree. Okay, but except that, the young people have always been a bit more young and left and excited, and they have always been a bit more educated than the old people. By definition, the new cohort are always a bit more educated. So when you control for age and sex, okay, the curve goes down a little bit, as you expect, but it always goes down a little bit, as you expect, and not by that much. So this has really no effect at all on the trend. Okay, so controlling for age and sex is not going to do anything. If you control for income or wealth, it goes the opposite way. The curve, the level of the curve goes up, which is exactly what you expect, because as we will see, high income, high wealth tend to vote more for the right. So in effect, when you control for income, the effect of education is to bring you even more to the left than what you thought without controlling for income. So the most left people will be people with a high education degree and very low income. But this has always been more or less the case. So you do your controls, this doesn't change anything. I also control for father's occupation. Sorry, I don't have mother's occupation in the survey all along. This is the same. So, you can put all the controls you want. You have something that is really quite strong. So here, this is the same, but looking at top 10 education versus bottom 90, which I think is the most meaningful way, or least stupid way to compare the data over time, is to rank people by deciles of education. So let me now show you the results for income and wealth, and you will see that it's fairly different. So the income profile of the vote is actually fairly flat for the bottom 90%, but then for the top 10%, people vote much more for the right. Less so in recent years than at the beginning of the period, but it's still the case. Now, the wealth profile has always been much stronger than the income profile. So let me show you the data. So this is the income profile. So you have deciles of income, and then at the top, I distinguish top 5%, top 1%. So I typically have 15 brackets, sometimes 20 brackets, so I can sort of approximate the deciles. It's not perfect, but the pattern is pretty clear. Now, this simple kind of evidence I had never seen before. I mean, there's nothing so very complicated in what I did, but I had never seen before sort of an attempt to look over time at this pattern of income, in particular as compared to wealth, which I will show you on the next slide. So what you see here is that for the bottom 90%, it's actually pretty flat in France. This is because you have lots of poor peasants in France who don't like the left too much for all sorts of good reasons. Typically, they own a little bit of something in the countryside, and they feel the left wants to appropriate them, and so they don't like the left. They have good historical reason for that. And this is why in the bottom, in the end, you have different counterbalancing effect, and you don't have much of a slope. Whereas in Britain, and also in the US, the slope is stronger in the bottom 90%. But then at the top, it's very strong also in France. So you can see in particular in the 50s, 60s, 70s, look, if you take the election of 1978, which was a very contested legislative election in France with, again, Mitterrand and Giscard, if you are in the top 1%, more than 85% vote for Giscard, so you really don't like the left at all. Now, if you look at the same scale and the same graph for wealth, this is what you get, which I find quite striking. So you can see that wealth, so this is asset ownership. So the good thing is that in the French survey, I have pretty detailed question about whether you own real estate, land, financial assets. There are some surveys where you have the exact amount, other surveys where you have only bracket information, but anyway, you can construct an index of wealth and a sort of measure or estimate of the wealth decile. Data is not perfect, but the pattern is incredibly clear. So you can see, in a way, it's not surprising that property is the main determinant of voting historically, because the major political conflict in the 20th century has been about property. The left was about socialism, public ownership of means of production, and the right has been against the left. So, it's not too surprising that, if you own a lot, you really don't like the left too much, and if you don't own anything, you feel that the right doesn't care too much about you. So it's not, but this is something which I had never seen before, and which I think is important, because it means that when you look at income, you're looking at the aggregation of very different effects, wealth, education, and this is why sometimes you don't see really what's happening. So what I'm going to do in what follows is that I'm going to summarize this curve by looking at the gap between the top 10 and the bottom 90. I could do top 50 versus bottom 50, it will give the same. And so what you can see is that over time, the gap, at the end of the period, the top 10%, wealth are less frightened by Hollande in 2012 than by Mitterrand in 1974-78. So they are getting up, but they are still, they still prefer to vote for Sarkozy. So this is different than for education, where you could see that the higher education were voting Hollande rather than Sarkozy. So this is where the multiple elite system has been created. Now you have, the different dimensions of social inequality, education, wealth, income, are not politically aligned anymore. In spite of the fact that the structural correlation between these three dimensions has not changed over time, at least in the data set I'm using. So if you look at the correlation between education and wealth, it's like 0.3, 0.2 in the data set. It's not perfect data to measure correlation between these different dimensions, of course, but at least as the first approximation, it seems pretty flat over time. So it's more the politicization of these different dimensions that has changed. At the beginning of the period, somehow some parties were able to put all the people at the bottom in the same coalition, whereas at the end of the period, they have multiple political representation. So if you look, so one way to summarize everything is to have, the red curve is for education, the blue curve is for income, and the green curve is for wealth. So you can see that the green is always below the blue, which is always below the red, which just says that high wealth is always more associated to the right than high income, which is more associated to the right than high education, which is already interesting, which we find in all other countries for which we have data. But at the end of the period, so 2017, I have put a dashed line because, in 2017, it's really the time in France and also in 2016 in the US where sort of it's a sort of final breakdown of the decomposition of the left-right party system that was already under major change for many decades. And so here I look at what I call the left vote in 2017 are the 52% of the electorate which voted for the left candidates, Mélenchon, Hamon, and Macron, as opposed to the 48% of the electorate who voted for Fillon, Le Pen, and other right-wing candidates. So, of course, the first half does not govern together, as you have noticed, and they would be completely unable to govern together. So this shows that it's a complete breakdown of the previous, coalition system. But what's interesting is that in the end, the big pattern is in the continuity of the previous system. So I think it's the final breakdown is due to the fact that in effect the left was more and more tiered between sort of the Brahmin left that were more promoting the interest of high education and more high-income elite, and another group that was still trying to promote more redistributive policy. And in a way, you have the same thing in the right side of the electorate. So this is for France. Let me. I'm going to move right away to the US case. Let me simply say that, so for the US case, as I said before, the issue of racial conflict, plays a major role in US politics, and a common explanation for the change in the electorate structure in the US is the white flight from the Democratic Party. Now, the equivalent for France will be attitude toward migrants, but as I said, it really comes very much later. Not in the 60s, it becomes really big, the rise of the National Front in the 80s, and even more so 90s and 2000 and today. So I don't think this can be the main explanation for the long-run evolution, but still, at the end of the period, it certainly becomes also very important in France. So let me just show you. So in France, in the French context, you don't ask about race, which I think is good. You ask about religion, and you also ask in the recent survey about the country of birth of your grandparent, and I will move to that later. But it's only starting in 2007 that you have a question about the country of birth of your grandparent. What you have starting in 1967, I think, is a question about religion. Okay, so practicing Catholics, in my classification, here I think I have put as practicing Catholic, you only need to go once a month. And I'm not even sure they go once a month. Anyway, and the other are non-practicing Catholic. So the no religion have increased from 6% to 35%. In Britain, it's even more. They have increased to over 40%. Okay, so other religion, okay, when it was 3%, it was basically 1.5% Protestant, 1% Jewish, and 0.5% other Buddhist, Muslim. But okay, Muslim is classified separately starting in 1988, and at that time, this is less than 1%. At the end of the period, you get 5%. Remember, this is people who are registered in the electorate, so you need to be French citizen. It takes time, and you need to register. If you look at the entire population, it would be more 7-8%, people who describe themselves as Muslim, which is, of course, very different from having some family origin in Muslim country, and you'll see the numbers are quite different. You have about almost half of the people who have a grandparent in, for instance, in North Africa who describe themselves as Muslim. So these are two very different notions, obviously. But here I look at this, not because I'm obsessed with the religion of people, but because I have it in my data set, so I want to see what impact this has on political attitude. Regarding, Christian religion, it's very clear, practicing Catholics vote for the right, people without religion vote for the left. The gap has declined a little bit over time. The novelty is the Muslim vote, which, as you can see, has always been, 90% for the left, 80 to 90%, which is exactly what you see with the black vote in the US, 90% Democrat. What's the explanation? Well, I think both in the US and in France, the explanation is that black voters in the US or Muslim voters in France, perceive a lot of hostility on the other side. And they feel, so it's not, it's not that they love same-sex marriage promoted by Hollande. There's nothing in the questionnaires that suggests that. So on family values, etc., they probably don't like the left too much, but they feel so much hostility against them on the right-wing side, not only the extreme right, but also the so-called center-right, but which can be quite extreme also, that they just vote for the parties they feel can protect them a little more than the other. Okay? So at least that's a reasonable interpretation, but this also shows you how a little change in the structure of the electorate, from 0% Muslim to 5%, can have a complete change in the overall structure. It used to be the case that the less religious you are, you more vote for the left, and suddenly you have the... By the way, all the Muslim voters are not very religious. If you look at the practice, it's a little bit like the Catholic voters. The majority of them report to go to the mosque less than once a month, so it's not as if it's huge religiosity. But in any case, it has a completely different politicization of religiosity. So these are small samples, but so at the beginning of the period, the standard errors are huge, but at the end of the period, I mean, you can see it's a huge impact. 45 percentage point. The impact of education, remember, it was like going from -10 or -20 to +10 or +20. Here, 40, this is like for the black vote in the US, this is sort of kills every other effect. You can put income control, education control. Of course, that's going to reduce a little bit the effect, but as you can see, it's still very strong. And you get the same for African American vote in the US. So you clearly have the identity conflict has become strong. I'm not trying to deny that, but I'm just saying that if you look at the long-run evolution, the reversal of the education cleavage seems to start much earlier than this becomes a very salient dimension of conflict. And when you look at other countries where the migration conflict has never become really big, you see also this kind of reversal in the long run. So to me, this is not perfect evidence. We are not in the area of controlled experiments. Sorry about that. We have to do with what we have. But I think the evidence suggests that this is not the primary reason for the shift. Okay, if you look, so I told you, starting in 2007, you ask to people about whether they have foreign grandparents. So like in 2012, 9% of the electorate report to have at least one foreign grandparent outside of Europe, and this is mostly North Africa, a little bit sub-Saharan Africa. And 19% report to have a foreign grandparent in Europe. This is mostly Spain, Portugal, Italy. So these are the Latinos of France, if you want. Like in the US, they are 20%. Here, they are also 20%. But the difference is that they... I have some Italian origin. My wife is Spanish origin, so it's very common. But the difference is that, of course, the Latinos of France are not perceived as Latinos, and they vote the same as other voters. There's no difference. Whereas in the US, they will be intermediate between the white and the African American voters. Now you can see, people with extra European origin vote a lot for the left, although there's a specific Muslim religion factor that make you vote even more for the left. Again, probably because of the perceived hostility on the right. Okay, let me skip on that and move to the US case. And I had some material about the 2017 election, which I can return to in the questions if you have. But I want to use the next 5 minutes to show you more about the US and the UK. So US, okay, you have survey in the US starting in 1948. You have other survey organized by CNN, New York Times that have bigger sample size. These people have more money than academics, but they don't ask questions well. So in the end, I tend to prefer the smaller size survey, but I use both to check that everything is correct. So you all know about US presidential elections. According to my data, Hillary Clinton had 51% of the vote and Trump 49%, but I know there's some controversy about this. Anyway, so I'm going to compare, who votes. So I forget the third-party candidates, which are usually quite small, and I'm going to compare who's going to vote Democratic, Republican over time, and I'm going to get the same change for education, exactly the same change that I had before. So first, start with the racial pattern of the vote. So you can see in the 50s, before the 60s, the black will vote a bit more Democrats, but not so much. After the 60s, after the civil rights movement, blacks always vote 90% Democrat, and Latino and others vote intermediate between white and black. But if you had only white voters, there would not have been a Democratic president in the US since the 1960s, basically. Okay? So every Republican candidate, starting with Nixon in 1972, Reagan in 1980, Trump in 2016, of course, played very strongly the racial card and the anti-African American discourse in different manners, or anti-Latino in the most recent period discourse. So this has become a major issue of division in the US. If you put control, you still have a huge minority vote effect. This is exactly the same order of magnitude than what I got for the Muslim vote in France, and I will get the same for the Muslim vote or Hindu vote in the UK a bit later. So I already made this comparison between France and the US. So, the big difference is that in the US, sort of the Latino are in the middle between the African American and the white, whereas in France, the people with Spanish or Italian origin vote like those with no foreign origin. Otherwise, the percentage are very similar, 70%, 20, 10. So it's a different kind of structure of diversity in origins, and the politicization is not exactly the same, but it has some interesting commonalities. Okay, so this is the vote for Democratic Party by education level. So you can see in 1948, if you have a higher education degree, you vote Republican like crazy, you don't like the Democrats at all. At the end of the period, it's exactly the opposite. So if you have a PhD, it's 2% electorate in purple. You don't see the 2% very well, but you vote 75% for Hillary Clinton. And I don't even know where the other 25% are, because you don't meet them too much on campus. Now, which, I don't know if it's good or bad, but as a matter of fact, it's politicized in a very strong way and reverse way. You still have, people with only primary degree, so high school dropout, who vote a bit more for the Democrats at the very bottom, but it's only 9% of the electorate, and it's entirely a minority effect. Once you control, it's monotonically increasing. So if you look at the evolution over time, it's just the same as for France. So this is voting Democrat among university graduate minus non-university graduate. If you look at top 10% vis-à-vis bottom 90%, this is the same. So this is really a long-run evolution. Now, if you look, okay, this is, I have put too many lines on this graph, but I wanted to put all the data, but this was stupid because you have... But anyway, what you see, the only thing I want you to remember is that 2016 is special, in the sense that in 2016, for the first time ever, the top 10% vote Democrat. Okay? So this is the first time, top 10% income voters would always vote more Republican. For the first time, they vote Democrat, which gives you this graph, which is for the first time in 2016, in fact, the Democrats are getting both the high education and the high income elite. So you have a complete reversal as compared to the 40s. Now, it could be that this is because Trump is completely crazy, and when the Republicans come with a more reasonable candidate, then the high income, high wealth will return Republican. Or it could not be like that. You don't know. So it looks like you have a complete transformation of the system. And in the end, both the bottom education, bottom income, bottom wealth voters now vote more for the Republican. So again, one of the democratic story will be, well, these people don't understand all the good things we do for them. They are just too racist to understand. And I'm not saying, racial attitudes play a role, but I think it's a bit too simple given the long-run evolution that we see across countries to just explain everything like this. I think the change in the policy platform proposed that is perceived at least to be much more in favor of high education group than bottom education group, to me is equally a plausible assumption. Looking at Britain, and I'm gonna stop there. I just want to show you, okay, so this is Britain. Britain. Clement Attlee became the first Labour Party, with a Labour majority in 1945, put in place the National Health Service and lots of great things. And then you have Thatcher, you have Blair, you have Corbyn 2017. So here I have put away, sorry for all the Liberal Democrat supporters in the room, I have put them away because they were less than 10% in 1945 and less than 10% in 2017. And, well, sometimes they were bigger over the period. Anyway, I look at Labour Conservative. I get, as I said, the same general evolution for the structure of the vote by education. Here, this is with the top 10% education. So I already talked about that. If you compare with Britain and US, it's sort of lagging behind, but going in the same direction. Now, this is the interesting part. So you can see in 2017, it's very different from what you get in the US. So, in the US, remember the high-income voter will go for the Democratic Party. Whereas here, the high-income voters, they don't like Corbyn at all. So I think they are a bit lost because they don't like Brexit too much either, but they seem to hate Corbyn more than they hate Brexit. And so in the end, you have the gap between the high education and the high-income, high-wealth voter tends to amplify in Britain in 2015-16, whereas in the US it was different. So what this shows is that, you know, here what I've shown you today is a lot about how people vote, but so sort of the demand for politics or the demand side of the process. But of course, there's also a supply side where parties can have different strategy. And so Corbyn leads to a different electorate than Hillary Clinton, and you know, probably Bernie Sanders would have led to a different electorate than Hillary Clinton. And so, you know, I think we are just at a time where, because of this two-dimensionality of the political conflict, or actually many dimensionality, but in particular two dimensions, wealth, education, and a third one about identity issues, you can have multiple equilibria and evolution. So. To summarize, you know, Britain, the multiple elite system seems to amplify, whereas in France and in the US, especially in the US, all the elites seems to unite together in one side, at least for the time being. But you know, I think this is really very unstable situation. Okay, you also have the Muslim vote in Britain that is very similar to France. I'm not gonna. Okay, I think I should get right away to the conclusion because I'm already past time. So let me summarize what we have done. You know what I'm trying to show you in this presentation is that globalization, migration, and I think even more importantly, educational expansion have created new multidimensional conflict about inequality, leading to the collapse of the post-war left versus right party system. So why didn't democracy reduce inequality? Well, you know, the simpler explanation is because multidimensional coalitions are complicated, and without a strong egalitarian internationalist platform that was there after World War II, partly for exceptional reasons, but also partly because some collective organization parties, try to mobilize to build this program and policy platform. You know, there was this possibility to put all the majority of low education, low income, or low wealth voters from different origin. So even if you didn't have less extra-European origin at the time, you have urban origin, rural origin. It's always complicated to put together people coming with so many different dimensions of social stratification. But without such a strong platform, it's even more difficult. Racism, nativism, and the rise of higher education are powerful forces that can divide the poor if there's no strong, united platform. Good news is that social sciences, I think, can help. And I think, I don't want to seem ironical with all the great people who do controlled experiment, natural experiment, but I think there are important issues that cannot be solved by doing, experimental empirical work. And I think constructing long-run historical series and just trying to understand what we see, without a magic bullet to solve a causality problem, but just trying to think and talk about what we see and how this can be interpreted can also be a way to learn in the social sciences, and I think in some cases can be much more productive than just being obsessed with the identification of causality. That being said, let me stop there. Frank, my past president.
Hello, my next president. No, I was really fascinated by your focus on Michael Young and the rise of the meritocracy. And here comes the but. But I would suggest you think more about an earlier publication of his, which was called Let Us Face the Future. He was the one who drafted the Labour Party manifesto in 1945.
Yes.
And in my view, that is the key document which switched political attitudes in Britain. If we have a revolutionary war, it's the Second World War, because a lot of the intellectual elite in the 1944-1945 were serving in the armed forces, and if you look at the composition of the Harold Wilson government in the 60s through the 70s, a lot of the senior ministers there both had a very considerable record in the academic elite, and also had formed their socialism in uniform in the Second World War. So you think of Tony Crosland, Tony Blair, Dennis Healey, people like that. And interestingly, in terms of sort of conflict between the political parties, what happened was in that first government, 1945 to 1951, where the slogan was never again. We don't go back to the 1930s. after that, the Conservatives sort of adapted almost completely, so that, yes, there were still Conservatives, but they'd moved so much to what the Labour Party was doing. They'd accepted a lot of the nationalisation and all this kind of thing.
Service,
yeah. Well, national service and so on, but I mean, one could see that as a hangover from the Second World War. But the explicit commanding heights thing of the Labour Party was tacitly taken on board by the Conservatives, and it was certainly nothing like the kind of thing that one sees later under Thatcher and so on. But anyway, just a little comment.
Yeah, I don't think I disagree with this. No, I think you're right that in the 40s, 60s, I mean, the entire spectrum was moved to the left in a way, or at least, following the Great Depression, following World War II, etc. Everybody agreed that sort of capitalism had to be tightly controlled by government in order to avoid having a new collapse, a new war, etc. So that's part. I think that's also part of the rise of this class-based distributive conflict. But so in 1945, from what I remember, yes, Michael Young is still very positive about what the labor is going to be able to do in power. I mean, he's directly involved. But then my reading of his book in 1958 is that getting in the early 50s, he starts to say, okay, we have done all these great things about nationalization. National health sector, progressive taxation of income and inheritance, but we have a problem with education, or at least this is the way. I mean, I've read several articles by him saying that, and certainly this is the message of his book, The Rise of Meritocracy. If we don't pay enough attention to comprehensive, I mean, basically he wants labor to push a comprehensive school agenda, so everybody in the same high school. He would like labor to push this agenda much more than they do. And he believes, or at least that's what he wrote at the time of his book in 1958, that if the labor, they don't do that and they don't espouse this cause of sort of inclusive educational investment, then we are going to move toward a society of rising educational stratification, and the whole party system that we have built will fall apart. That's his message. So I don't think it's inconsistent with Michael Young of 1945. It's just that he has a bit changed his mind 13 years later, and I think he sees ahead a challenge with the rise of education as a new form of stratification, which I think is quite visionary.
The 45 election was today.
Incredible. Yeah. Well, let's commemorate. Yes. I don't know whether.
Here.
Yes.
Thank you very much for your great presentation. I just had a quick question about developing countries, and particularly given the fact that early in your talk you discussed how the top 1% or top 10% has gathered a greater share of wealth in developed countries and developing countries, and I'm now going to explain part of the story using the developed countries voting data. But I guess in developing countries there isn't this same clear right to left spectrum at all. So any words on that would be greatly appreciated.
Right, so you're perfectly right. So let me describe quickly what we've done on India, and also what Amaury Guetin has done on Brazil, and Amaury can add something if he wants. So for India, it's interesting that you start from a situation, in the 50s, 60s, where of course you have a sort of hegemonic party coming out of independence, the Congress Party, that is really a catch-all party. So they get 60% of the vote from everywhere, from the Muslim, from the lower caste, but also from the Brahmin and upper caste, and so there's no strong cleavage at the time. You start with a sort of hegemonic catch-all party, and then what we see over time is that clearly with the rise of the BJP, in the 80s, 90s, and even more so in the last two elections, you see that the electorate becomes more divided along caste dimension, partly reflecting educational and income dimension, but clearly there's a specific caste dimension that is related to also to the specific quota policies and reservation policies. So I mean, as you know, BJP has been very strongly opposed to the extension of quota to the Muslim, which now did not have many seats in the initial system of reservation for scheduled caste and scheduled tribe, but with the extension of quotas to OBCs and other backward classes in 1990, many Muslims in effect benefited from the quota. And so this was a key issue on which BJP, constructed its discourse and identity. And so you can see in the structure of the electorate how, in effect, India has moved toward a specific form of class conflict. So in a way, at the time, Western countries were going away from class conflict. India was constructing its own form of class conflict, which is more a caste conflict, but it's partly a class conflict. With the big difference is that the lower caste Hindu voters vote for largely from the same party as the poor Muslim voters, which of course is so all the poor, if you want, vote for the same party, which is not the case in the West anymore. And I think here the key reason is that there's a policy tool, in particular the quota system, which sort of in effect make some built-in solidarity between the poor Muslim and the poor Hindu. So, looking at these different countries is very interesting because you can see that there's no natural reason why the poor, should be anti-Muslim or racist or whatever. It's all constructed historically depending on the policy platforms that you have in order to convince the different people that what they have in common is possibly more important than their differences. And so you can see, so in the case of Brazil, it's also interesting to see that the PT electorate in the first election after the end of military regime in 1989 and early 1990s was not strongly tilted toward lower class voters, whereas after Lula got to power, you can really see that the electorate in the re-election of Lula and the first election of Dilma Rousseff, was very strongly lower education, lower income. It moved a lot to the northeast of the country, whereas before it was more, urban Sao Paulo voters. So in effect, you also have something like a class conflict that is being developed in Brazil, which in the recent election did not end up very well. But it's so. The bottom line is that outside, as you were saying, outside of Western context, you don't start from this left-right conflict of the 50s, 60s. You start sometimes from no clear class cleavage, but then sometimes you see along the way the construction of a class division depending on the different strategies to politicize redistribution and inequalities in the different countries. So bottom line is that it's all also socially and politically constructed. It's not there's no sort of deterministic mechanism that implies that left should be like this and right should be like that. Yes.
Sorry, it was quite interesting.
I take 3 questions and okay.
While you are looking at the pattern of voting with higher education, so putting higher education in one bracket, particularly in the developing country context, when you are going to look at the Indian context, it's sometimes difficult because even if you are highly educated, what kind of higher education you have received, that determines whether you will go for left and right. It's not only higher education, because what the recent trend is showing in the 2 votings, the highly educated people who are largely from elite private institutions, they are towards right, where in public they are towards left. So that kind of situation is also existing in the context.
Okay. So maybe we take 2 other questions and I answer to all. Sorry, but yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for a very fascinating presentation. So my understanding is that France has recently, removed the wealth tax, right? I mean, recently. And, if you watch the news in the US, then one of the US presidential candidates, recently raised the idea of, we should have a wealth tax, I mean, in the US. So can you please comment on this in terms of, rising inequality? Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, I will do that, yes.
Hi, Dhamma.
Yeah.
So I thought this was fascinating, but I thought the part that was less developed was the part where the endogeneity of the policies that follow from the political party platforms, given their changing constituents. And in particular, also, it's not at all clear that the people who most favor you within a group are the people that you aim to please. It often might be the marginal voter. But in any case, that whole part about how this matters to the party platforms or the policies that they try to implement, I would have loved to see a bit more of that.
So, yeah, very good point. Well, you should read my next book. That's all I can say. Now, well, it's a bit long, I'm sorry, but it's a long story because I try to do that in the book. But, okay, to be honest, I don't do it completely. So you will not be completely satisfied, but at least I try to go in this direction and try to analyze, the sort of two-way causality between the changing policy platform and the changing structure of the electorate. But I certainly agree, I think there was no plan to make it like this. It's not that someone, Michael Young was very visionary, but there was no one in the Democratic Party or Labour Party or French Socialist Party which sort of decided, okay, we are going to be nice with the higher education people, and 50 years from now we will specialize in the higher education. But of course it did not happen like this. So it was a sequence of adjustment. But I think in the end, yeah, when people sort of realize, the thing is that when you've promoted the idea of emancipation through education for a long time, those who are more successful in the education game tend to be more attached to you than those who are less successful. So I think this happened partly like this, and then when you realize that your electorate is so much more higher education and a bit more higher income, you in the end you sort of also change your policy. But it's a very complicated and subtle process which I don't analyze as well. The thing is that policy platforms are not perfectly comparable over time. There is some materials. There has been some attempt to correct policy platform, but it's not as if you could know perfectly well what the different parties propose in terms of reform of the education system, and let alone how they are perceived. So it's difficult to. Which brings me also to the question about educational stratification. So. Okay, I fully agree with you. I would love to be able to compare people who graduate from private universities, public universities, who graduate in business, who graduate in sociology, and you can imagine how different it will be. I cannot do that because in the data I don't have that information. So the most I have in the data is the level of degree, PhD degree, master degree, bachelor degree. I don't know anything else in this post-electoral survey. So then you will need to use other data, localized level data where you have information more precise, but it's difficult. It's difficult. You have to find some new sources. I finish with the wealth tax. So why is it that France sort of abolished the wealth tax just when the US could create a wealth tax? Well, this will be evidence that there's still hope in the US, I would say. That the US is not completely lost in Trumpism, and so look, it's but you have to have in mind. I have not shown you these tables on the. Electorate. In the France since 2017, you had really an electorate divided into 4 quarters. So here I have put the first round of the presidential election. You have basically it's very rare to have, you had 4 candidates. If you just, so here I have put Hamon with Mélenchon and Dupont-Aignan with Le Pen, but if you just take Mélenchon, Macron, Fillon, Le Pen, they all had between 20 and 24% of the vote. It's very rare, an election where 4 candidates are between 20 and 24% of the vote in the first round. Usually, because of strategic voting, you go for the top 2, sometimes for the top 3, but top 4, it is just unheard of. So what this suggests is that there was a very strong ideological division of the electorate, which here I divide into, what I call, internationalist egalitarian, internationalist inegalitarian, nativist inegalitarian, nativist egalitarian, which is basically on the basis of the response to 2 questions. Are there too many migrants in France? And in order to achieve social justice, we need to take from the rich to go to the poor. And basically, as you can see, if you take the left electorate, Mélenchon-Hamon, they are the most open to migrants. Only 32% believe that there are too many migrants. And they are the most in favor of redistribution. 67% want to take from the rich, give to the poor. Macron electorate, they really don't want to take from the rich, give to the poor. And they are less open to migrants than Mélenchon-Hamon, but still relatively open. Fillon electorate, they hate the idea to take from the rich, give to the poor. Fillon lives in a big manor in Sarthe, and they don't like, they think there are too many migrants. And the Le Pen electorate, okay, they hate migrants, 91% believe there are too many of them, but they are poorer electorate. So the strange situation, and I stop there, is that you have these two questions on migrants and rich versus poor, which both you have sort of 50-50 of the electorate on both sides, but these two dimensions are completely uncorrelated. So it gives rise to 4 quarters, basically. And so this is the basic sort of 4 quarters of the electorate. So to summarize, the situation is very unstable. You know, any 2 of the top 4 candidates could have made it to the second round, and nobody knows what would have happened. And you know, so this is a very unstable situation, and this is my conclusion. Thanks a lot.